Darkness pressed down like a velvet curtain, and the earth was silent above her. Then, scratching. A faint, frantic scraping from inside a wooden box, 6 feet under. In the 1800s, the fear of being buried alive wasn't superstition, it was a medical panic. Across Victorian England and America, people went to bed terrified they might wake up underground. Doctors couldn't always distinguish death from deep coma. Families began installing bells, tubes, even windows, into coffins. But then came the true horror, the stories of those who did wake up. What triggered this mass dread? Who invented the bizarre contraptions to keep it at bay? And most chilling of all, how many were buried before these safety coffins existed? It began with a scream, muffled, hoarse and rising from beneath the earth. Grave diggers at London's Highgate Cemetery recoiled in horror as the soil trembled above a freshly buried coffin. At first they thought it was just imagination, until they heard it again. A desperate pounding, a human voice. Someone, alive, was trapped underground. The year was 1889, and the Victorian world was gripped by a very real and very terrifying fear, being buried alive. This wasn't just a macabre fantasy or literary device. Premature burial, or taphophobia, haunted the public consciousness like a ghost in a gaslit alleyway. Tales spread like wildfire through newspapers, penny dreadfuls, and hushed whispers at funeral wakes. Stories of exhumed bodies found with shredded fingernails, broken bones, or twisted expressions frozen in terror. Medical science was advancing, but death still had its uncertainties, and for many Victorians, nothing was more horrifying than waking up in total darkness, surrounded by cold wood and 6 feet of earth. At the heart of this panic was a disturbing truth. Doctors in the 19th century weren't always sure how to determine death. Comas, catalepsy and epilepsy could mimic death's stillness. Pulse checks were unreliable. Breathing could be so shallow it went undetected. There were even cases of people declared dead who later revived on the autopsy table, or during their own funeral. But the story that cemented this fear in the public mind was that of a young woman buried alive, an event that would change how Victorians designed their coffins, grieved their dead, and defined the very boundary between life and death. She was known only as Margaret, an otherwise unremarkable young woman from Lancashire. After falling ill during a harsh winter, she was pronounced dead by the family physician. Her body was cold, her breathing had stopped, a death certificate was signed. She was laid to rest in the village cemetery, but 3 days later, local boys playing near the grave heard scratching sounds. By the time help arrived, it was too late. Her coffin lid was clawed, her fingers bloodied, and her mouth twisted in a final scream. The tale exploded across Britain. Whether entirely true or embellished through gossip and fear, it galvanized public obsession with the idea of escaping the grave. Engineers, doctors, and inventors all rushed to solve the problem, and what they created was nothing short of Victorian horror ingenuity: the safety coffin. From bells connected to buried hands, to air tubes snaking through the soil, to elaborate contraptions involving flags, mirrors, and even feeding systems, Victorians went to extreme lengths to ensure they wouldn't be mistaken for dead. Some coffins even included speaking tubes, allowing the buried to shout up to the surface. Others came with glass windows built into the lid, so mourners could keep watch for movement during the wake. And yet, despite all the innovations, the fear never left. If anything, it grew more fevered, because every safety device was also a reminder. Death wasn't always certain, and in the shadows of graveyards, something might still be breathing. In this chilling journey, we'll explore the history, science, and social panic behind Victorian safety coffins. We'll meet the inventors who tried to cheat death, the families who buried loved ones with ropes in their hands, and the institutions that exploited fear for profit. But we begin with the legend that started it all: Margaret, the girl who woke up in her grave. In the dim candle-lit parlours of Victorian England, death was not the end, it was a liminal state, a doorway fraught with uncertainty. And among all the fears that haunted the age of mourning veils and crepe-draped mirrors, one rose above the rest: the fear of being buried alive. It even had a name, taphophobia, from the Greek taphos, meaning grave, and phobos, meaning fear. It wasn't merely paranoia. This was a documented obsession rooted in chilling reality. In the 18th and 19th centuries, medicine was advancing, but far from precise. Diagnosing death was often based on subjective observation. No stethoscopes, no brain scans, no certainty. A person suffering from catalepsy, epilepsy, cholera, or even severe alcohol poisoning could appear lifeless. Heartbeats too faint to detect, breathing shallow, eyes closed. Physicians, pressured to act quickly due to decay or disease outbreaks, sometimes pronounced death prematurely. In the rush to preserve public health, the body might be quickly buried, and with it, a living soul. Newspapers across Europe and America told stories that chilled the spine. Exhumed bodies found twisted inside their coffins, faces frozen in horror, fingernails broken from clawing at the wood, reports of blood in the mouths of the dead, torn burial shrouds, even bite marks on their own arms. These tales, whether truth, exaggeration, or urban myth, spread like wildfire. One infamous case comes from 1822, where the body of a young woman was exhumed days after her burial in France. The coffin lid bore deep gouges. Her fingers were bloodied, her face contorted. She had been buried alive. Another account in South Carolina in 1851 described a woman revived during her own wake, only to collapse and die for real days later. For the Victorians, these weren't just macabre tales, they were warnings. Writers fueled the fear. Edgar Allan Poe's 1844 story, The Premature Burial, fictionalized real events and drove public obsession into overdrive. In it, Poe wrote, "To be buried while alive is beyond question the most terrific of these extremes which has ever fallen to the lot of mere mortality." The line echoed in drawing rooms, mortuaries, and across the Atlantic. Wealthier families began demanding waiting mortuaries, places where the deceased were kept under watch for days, just in case they awoke. Others turned to technology. Enter the bizarre rise of safety coffins, an entire industry dedicated to ensuring no one was ever interred alive again. But before we look at their elaborate mechanics, we need to understand just how far the fear had gripped society. Churches held vigils. Newspapers debated the ethics of waiting days before burial. Some death certificates began requiring confirmation by multiple physicians. And on gravestones, inscriptions sometimes included haunting lines like, "I may not be dead, look again." Death had become a riddle, one that could be solved too late. Even cemeteries were reimagined. Graveyards in London and New York designed burial systems with airflow and alarm cords. Coffins were made with spring-loaded latches and air vents. A person awakening underground had, in theory, a few desperate moments to act, and to be saved. For the average citizen, though, the fear lingered. What if no one heard the bell? What if the string broke? What if it wasn't a mistake, but a conspiracy? This societal panic didn't exist in a vacuum. It was shaped by rapid industrialization, war, and epidemic outbreaks. In a world where death came swiftly and unpredictably, trust in institutions, medical and religious alike, was shaking. Safety coffins were not just practical devices. They were symbols of a culture desperately trying to exert control over the unknown. But how exactly did these so-called safety coffins work? Who designed them? And did they ever save a life? Let's descend now into the strange, mechanical world of the Victorian death alarm, and the inventors who made peace with mortality one bell at a time. As panic turned to innovation, the Victorian imagination gave rise to one of the most morbid yet fascinating inventions of its time, the safety coffin. These weren't the creations of fiction or fevered dreams. They were patented devices, built and sold to grieving families desperate to ensure their loved ones would not suffer the unthinkable fate of waking beneath the earth. The earliest patents for these contraptions began appearing in the late 18th century. Dr. Christian Friedrich Hufeland, a German physician, proposed a system in 1791 where bodies would be held in corpse houses for several days before burial, with strings tied to their hands. If any movement occurred, a bell would ring. This idea would become the basis for nearly every safety coffin to come. The most famous design came from Franz Wester, who patented his improved burial case in 1868. His coffin included a bell mounted above ground, attached to a cord that ran through a tube into the coffin, tied to the hand of the deceased. A movement of the hand would jingle the bell, alerting cemetery workers, hopefully in time. But Wester wasn't alone. Dozens of patents followed, each more elaborate than the last. Some included viewing windows, allowing loved ones or caretakers to check for movement. Others had air tubes to provide oxygen should the occupant awaken. Some had flags that popped up, trap doors that could be opened from the inside, and even electric buzzers connected to nearby lodges. There was the Leach and Leach safety coffin, which included a ladder inside the burial vault and a mechanism to open the coffin lid from within. Another version had a speaking tube so the buried person could shout for help. Some included feeding tubes because if you were to survive long enough to be rescued, you might get hungry. These coffins weren't mass-produced oddities, they were commissioned and used. The wealthy paid top dollar for peace of mind, while middle-class families scraped together funds to afford at least the bell-string option. Graveyards began offering safety packages that included watchmen to respond if a bell rang in the night. But the question lingers, did they ever work? The answer is as mysterious as the devices themselves. While there are a few anecdotal accounts of lives allegedly saved by safety coffins, no well-documented rescue has ever been verified. Skeptics point out that, in many cases, the cords would rot or snap. The bells, exposed to wind or animals, might ring falsely or not at all. In some stories, the cords weren't even tied to the right hand, rendering the system completely useless. Still, the idea offered a form of psychological relief. In an age of epidemics where cholera or diphtheria could kill in hours, safety coffins gave grieving families a sense of control. More importantly, they gave the dying a bizarre form of hope. If the doctor got it wrong, perhaps they'd get a second chance. The rise of the safety coffin industry also reveals a deeper cultural truth, that Victorians, for all their scientific progress, still lived in fear of the great unknown. They measured death with a bell pull. They guarded it with trapdoors and mirrors. Some safety coffins were even built with test dummies to demonstrate their effectiveness. Newspapers covered live demonstrations where a person was buried inside, only to ring the bell and emerge triumphantly. One inventor allegedly buried his assistant alive for half an hour to prove his model worked, though few could verify the stunt. These stunts blurred the line between innovation and showmanship. The safety coffin became a spectacle, its promise equal parts salvation and snake oil. Eventually, as medical science improved and embalming became widespread, the market for safety coffins dwindled, but their legacy endured, in the patents, in the archives, and in the lasting public obsession with premature burial. It was this morbid anxiety that created a market for salvation beneath 6 feet of earth. And it was also this fear that inspired an entire culture to build alarms for the dead. But how far did this paranoia go? In the next segment, we'll explore the eerie phenomenon of waiting mortuaries, grim buildings where the dead weren't buried at all, not right away. Before the first shovel of dirt hit a coffin lid, another grim institution rose from Europe's panic over premature burial, the Leichenhaus or waiting mortuary. These buildings, especially popular in Germany and parts of Central Europe, weren't cemeteries. They were halfway houses between life and death. In a time when medical diagnostics were crude and death was not always a clear line, the fear of being declared dead prematurely drove city councils and medical boards to endorse a terrifying solution: don't bury the body at all, at least not right away. These mortuaries were cold, stone buildings designed to house the recently deceased. Corpses would be laid out, sometimes for days, on display. Attendants, often medical students, monks or gravediggers, watched over the dead 24 hours a day, just in case someone moved. The paranoia was real. The body might twitch, or a chest might rise from trapped air, or a finger spasm from nerve decay. Any motion was taken as potential life. Some facilities even tied strings to fingers, just like in safety coffins, linked to bells in case the deceased stirred. But most chilling of all were the body inspection rooms. Here, corpses were not only monitored, They were kept under strict observation for any signs of decay. Only when decomposition clearly began, confirming death, was the body allowed to be buried. The atmosphere inside these buildings was morbidly serene. Row after row of bodies, often dressed in their funeral clothing, laid out under skylights or oil lamps. Fresh flowers were sometimes placed beside them to mask the scent. Mirrors were positioned to detect breath, and doors were always left unlocked, just in case someone regained consciousness and had the strength to walk out. One of the most famous of these buildings stood in Munich, Germany. The Munich Waiting Mortuary, opened in the early 19th century, could hold up to 36 bodies. Visitors could peer in and view the corpses, a macabre practice that attracted tourists and locals alike. It was death as performance, death as a public exhibit. Other cities followed suit. Vienna, Dresden and Prague constructed their own Leichenhäuser, each with variations on the same theme. Some added heated floors to stave off premature freezing. Others introduced primitive stethoscopes or heart monitoring devices long before ECGs existed. The idea was noble, in its own grim way. No one should suffer the horror of being buried alive. Yet critics pointed out that these buildings often delayed closure for families. Bodies sometimes decomposed before they were buried, and unsurprisingly, the dead never came back to life. Despite the low success rate, public fear remained high. Newspapers published accounts, some exaggerated, some invented, of people who sat up in their coffins or clawed their way out of shallow graves. These stories kept the waiting mortuary concept alive, even when medical experts began to cast doubt on their necessity. By the early 20th century, as medical diagnostics improved and embalming practices spread, waiting mortuaries fell out of fashion. Most were closed, repurposed, or demolished, but their shadow lingers in our culture. To this day, you'll find laws in some countries that require a mandatory delay between death and burial. In Italy and Germany, it's not uncommon for a body to be kept for at least 24 hours, just in case. And many morgues still include monitoring protocols inspired, however faintly, by the old Leichenhäuser. These places, though strange and eerie, served a psychological function. They gave the living a sense of security and, perhaps, offered the dead one final chance to say, I'm still here. If safety coffins and waiting mortuaries were the hardware of the premature burial panic, then the press was the engine that kept it roaring. In Victorian society, few things spread faster than fear, and fear sold newspapers. Beginning in the early 1800s, stories began to appear in European and American press that blurred the line between fact and fiction. Some were straightforward reports. A man supposedly found dead later revived in the morgue. A woman heard screaming from beneath her freshly dug grave. Others were clearly sensational, like the tale of a gravedigger who opened a coffin to find scratch marks and a look of terror frozen on the corpse's face. These stories ran rampant through a media landscape hungry for shock value. The public was gripped by tales of mistaken death, and many readers, especially those in rural communities, had no way to verify what they were reading. Fear became folklore. One of the most infamous accounts came from France in 1851. A young girl, buried after a cholera outbreak, was exhumed days later when her grieving parents claimed they had heard cries from her grave. Her fingernails were bloody, her face contorted. It was the perfect horror story, except no solid evidence ever confirmed it. Authors, too, played their part. Edgar Allan Poe's chilling 1844 short story The Premature Burial captivated readers. It wasn't just a fictional narrative, it reflected very real anxieties. Poe described his narrator suffering from catalepsy, a condition where the body mimics death. He is haunted by tales of people waking in tombs, screaming in darkness, pounding at coffin lids with bloodied fists. For Victorian readers, it struck a raw nerve. Newspapers routinely ran serialized accounts of such horrors, knowing full well they would drive readership. The more detailed and gruesome, the better. Pulp writers, operating under pseudonyms, flooded the market with twisted tales of grave mistakes, sometimes complete fabrications, sometimes built on whispers of truth. In 19th century England, penny dreadfuls, cheap, lurid fiction sold for a penny, further exaggerated the trend. Stories like The Mysterious Resurrection of Jane Simmons or Buried Alive A tale of the London plague added a dramatic flair to the already growing paranoia. And with literacy on the rise, these stories spread like wildfire. It wasn't just the poor and superstitious who were afraid. Even educated elites bought into the frenzy. Doctors gave lectures on how to distinguish true death from comas or trance-like states. Journalists quoted experts on the dangers of embalming the living. Some clergy even warned that hasty burials violated the sanctity of life and the soul's departure. Visual media soon joined the frenzy. Woodcut illustrations of skeletal hands breaking through dirt, or coffins split open to reveal screaming faces, became common in print. These images, often more terrifying than the articles themselves, seared into public imagination. Publications knew what they were doing. Panic was profitable, and for those already anxious about death, a constant in the disease-ridden pre-antibiotic world of the 1800s, these stories served as validation of their worst fears. The result was a society that no longer trusted death to be final. To die wasn't just terrifying, it was uncertain. By the end of the century, the fear had morphed from irrational panic to cultural obsession. Literature, tabloids, sermons, and even medical texts hinted at the same dreadful possibility. You might wake up in the dark, in the ground, alone. For most of human history, declaring someone dead wasn't a precise science. It was a best guess. No heartbeats, no breathing, no reaction. Death. But what if someone was only in a deep coma or suffering from catalepsy? In the 1800s, these conditions were often misunderstood or completely unknown. And so, science found itself locked in a disturbing dilemma. How do you prove someone is truly irreversibly gone? In the Victorian era, medical advancements surged. Yet ironically, so did the anxiety around misdiagnosing death. Autopsies revealed shocking discoveries: occasional corpses with bloodied fingers, twisted limbs, or coffin linings scratched raw. While some of these findings could be explained by decomposition gases or muscle contractions, they nonetheless fueled doubts. Were these people buried alive? Doctors began devising elaborate tests to confirm death. One involved holding a mirror to the mouth to detect breath. Others pricked fingertips with needles or poured hot wax on the skin. More morbid experiments used sharpened feathers in the nostrils, electric shocks, or even tongue-pulling contraptions. None were foolproof. One of the more infamous proposals came from Dr. Eugène Bouchou in 1846, who suggested inserting a long needle into the heart through the chest. If there was no resistance or pulse, the person could be declared dead. Naturally, this was controversial, even for its time. Victorian medicine was undergoing a revolution, but its tools were still primitive. Without electrocardiograms or brain scans, doctors relied on observation. But what if their eyes deceived them? The debate over defining death intensified in the medical community. Some proposed a waiting period, delaying burial by days or even weeks. This led to the rise of waiting mortuaries in Germany and other parts of Europe. Here, corpses would be laid out with bells tied to fingers, watched over by attendants trained to spot any sign of life. In 1895, the French Academy of Sciences listed over 30 proposed methods to verify death. These included injecting dye into the bloodstream to check circulation and using specially designed death masks that fogged up if the patient exhaled. Most were unreliable or downright medieval. It wasn't just about saving lives, it was about avoiding horrors. The dread of waking up 6 feet under, entombed in silence, was more than just a nightmare. It was a scenario made plausible by the limits of medicine. Some Victorian families began hiring private physicians to oversee burials, ensuring no mistake was made. Others insisted on open casket viewings, waiting days until visible signs of decay appeared before interment. The rich sometimes built mausoleums with mechanical escape systems, just in case. The line between life and death, once thought clear, now looked terrifyingly blurred. Medicine had entered the mystery, not solved it. Imagine waking up in darkness, the air is stale, movement is impossible. Panic sets in as you realize you're underground. This chilling fear wasn't just fiction in the 1800s. It was reality for a terrified public, which is why inventors across Europe and America poured their imaginations into one peculiar device, the safety coffin. These specially designed coffins promised one thing: escape, or at least rescue, if a person was mistakenly buried alive. The most iconic feature? A bell attached to a string placed in the hand of the supposed corpse. If the person awoke, even the faintest twitch of the hand would jingle the bell above ground. A graveyard attendant, always nearby, could then exhume the coffin immediately. In 1791, Duke Ferdinand of Brunswick was so afraid of premature burial that he demanded a window and lock inside his custom-built coffin, along with a key. His wasn't the only case. Inventors filed dozens of patents for life detection coffins. Some included air tubes, flags, whistles, spring-loaded lids, and even food compartments, just in case the rescue took a while. One of the most famous designs came from Dr. Johann Tabagier in 1829. His coffin linked a hand-tied string to a bell via a pulley system. But he went further. His model prevented false alarms by incorporating a weighted trigger system. Only real movement would set it off. Others were even more elaborate. A coffin patented in the US featured a ladder, a viewing window in the lid, and a hammer that would tap continuously until help arrived. Another allowed the revived person to raise a small flag, drawing attention during the day. Despite these efforts, there's little evidence that any safety coffin actually saved someone. But their popularity reflects just how widespread the fear of premature burial truly was. Some graveyards even advertised their use, charging higher burial fees for protected plots. This also reveals a society in which trust in medicine and technology was shaken. The safety coffin became a strange hybrid, part burial tool, part security system. It was Victorian paranoia turned into engineering. These coffins also created logistical problems. Grave watchers had to be trained and compensated. False alarms caused by wind or decomposing muscle contractions were common. Still, to many families, these devices were worth every penny. The alternative, accidentally burying a loved one alive, was simply too horrific to risk. In a grim twist, the presence of a bell above a grave could also have the opposite effect, causing panic rather than preventing it. Grave robbers reported bells ringing randomly in the middle of the night, likely due to animal activity or shifting soil, but the stories fed into ghost tales and vampire legends. Today, some of these safety coffins survive in museums. They stand as bizarre yet poignant artifacts of an age obsessed with the boundary between life and death. A reminder that fear, no matter how irrational it may seem now, once drove people to create machines of salvation beneath the soil. In the 19th century, newspapers weren't just sources of information, they were engines of fear, and nothing sold more papers than horror. The terrifying prospect of being buried alive became a goldmine for Victorian publishers, who churned out a steady stream of stories that blurred the line between reality and nightmare. Headlines screamed of corpses found turned over in their coffins, of claw marks on the inside of wooden lids, and of muffled cries heard too late. While many of these reports were unverified or flat-out fabricated, they tapped into a primal terror that was already brewing. For a public still adjusting to advances in medicine and still mystified by the line between death and unconsciousness, these tales were all too believable. Some of the most popular stories appeared in penny dreadfuls, cheap serialized fiction filled with sensationalism. In these pulp narratives, victims would awaken 6 feet under and claw their way to the surface, or go mad trying. These weren't just horror stories, they were warnings, and they fed directly into the rise of the safety coffin industry. Even respected newspapers weren't immune. The Times of London, the New York Herald, and other major outlets printed supposedly true accounts of premature burials. Some detailed eyewitness accounts from gravediggers or mourning family members who returned to find displaced earth and open lids. Others cited coroners, who claimed to find fingernail gouges or twisted limbs in exhumed coffins. Fictional writers also seized on the fear. Edgar Allan Poe's 1844 short story The Premature Burial was so convincing that many readers believed it was a true confession. In the story, the narrator is a man obsessed with the idea that he'll be mistaken for dead. His fears, of course, come true. Poe's vivid descriptions of suffocating darkness and growing madness mirrored what so many in the public already feared, and made those fears immortal in literature. This widespread panic had real effects. Governments began to take notice. Medical schools issued guidelines for more accurate death pronouncements. Some cities passed regulations requiring a waiting period before burial. In Paris, waiting mortuaries became common, rooms where bodies were stored and observed for signs of revival. And all the while, the press kept feeding the frenzy. Cartoons and political satire even mocked the trend, with images of corpses ringing bells or popping up from graves. But beneath the humour was genuine anxiety. After all, when newspapers printed letters from grieving family members who thought their loved ones had been buried alive, how could the public not listen? It was a perfect storm: medical uncertainty, limited diagnostics, cultural fears about the afterlife, and an eager press willing to exploit every drop of hysteria. The fear of premature burial didn't just rise organically, it was cultivated, printed, and sold by the millions. By the late 1800s, some publications had begun to question the truth of earlier stories. But the damage was done. The narrative of the buried alive had already embedded itself deep in the Victorian psyche, and in ours. Even today, the image of a person waking up in a coffin remains one of the most visceral fears ever recorded. As fear swept through the public, the medical world found itself in the crosshairs. Physicians and scientists of the 19th century were increasingly forced to confront a simple, horrifying question: how do we know for certain that someone is dead? The answers weren't as simple as we'd hope. Victorian medicine was in transition. On one hand, there were revolutionary breakthroughs in surgery, anaesthesia, and anatomy. On the other hand, diagnostics for death remained rudimentary. There were no electrocardiograms, no brain scans, no pulse oximeters. Often signs of death were determined by cold skin, dilated pupils, or apparent breathlessness, none of which were foolproof. This lack of certainty drove an intense medical debate. Some doctors proposed extended observation periods before burial, especially for those who died under suspicious or unclear circumstances. The idea of waiting mortuaries, already used in Germany and France, was promoted across Europe. These facilities often displayed the deceased in public or monitored them for days to see if signs of life returned. Medical journals published essays calling for reform. In 1870, the French doctor Eugène Bouchut proposed the use of a stethoscope to listen for heartbeats for a full 5 minutes before declaring death. Others advocated for the use of galvanism, applying electric shocks to the body to test for reactivity. But the results were inconsistent and often unnerving. Some cadavers would twitch or jerk, leading to even more fear and confusion. Meanwhile, more extreme tests circulated in the public imagination. Stories spread about placing mirrors under noses, burning toes with hot irons, inserting needles under fingernails, all in the name of confirming death. Whether these were urban legends or real practices is difficult to say, but the fact that people believed them speaks volumes. Yet even as the medical establishment tried to bring rationality to the table, superstition held firm. Many communities clung to folk beliefs. In parts of Eastern Europe, villagers would bury the dead with garlic or bind the feet, fearing they might rise again, not as revived humans but as vampires. Elsewhere, bells and breathing tubes in safety coffins were seen as more reliable than the doctor's word. This mistrust of science wasn't entirely irrational. Autopsies occasionally revealed individuals with blood in their lungs, clenched fists, or signs of movement, all suggesting they may have been alive when entombed. Whether these findings were misunderstood or exaggerated didn't matter. They cemented the belief that medicine couldn't always be trusted. The tension between emerging science and enduring superstition created a strange hybrid world. It was one where doctors might carry stethoscopes and crucifixes, where hospitals experimented with refrigeration while grieving families demanded that a mirror be held under their loved one's nose, just to be sure. As the century progressed, medicine improved. The understanding of brain death, circulation, and cellular decay advanced, but the damage to public trust lingered. For many Victorians, the physician wasn't a guardian of life, but a potential accomplice in a living burial. In the end, the fear wasn't just about death. It was about being forgotten, unheard, and declared gone too soon. And even as science offered answers, society's deeper fears of isolation, helplessness, and betrayal remained. By the mid-1800s, the terror of being buried alive wasn't just folklore, it was a design problem. And so, Victorian inventors, tinkerers, and engineers began to propose practical, if sometimes absurd, solutions. The result was a wave of patents for what would become known as safety coffins. These contraptions often began with one central idea: the entombed must be able to signal the living above. Some were fitted with ropes attached to bells, allowing a trapped corpse to ring for help. Others included flags, spring-loaded hatches, or even tubes designed to amplify sound. The goal was always the same: communication through 6 feet of soil. Perhaps the most iconic design was the bell system. A cord was tied around the deceased's hand, foot, or head. If the body moved, it would ring a bell above ground, usually placed near the gravestone or on a post. These became so common in certain cemeteries that groundskeepers had to patrol regularly, listening for phantom chimes. And they did hear them, though most were caused by shifting soil, decaying rope, or the wind. More ambitious safety coffins went even further. Some were fitted with air vents, feeding tubes, or even ladders. The premise was that if a person revived, they might survive long enough underground to be rescued or escape on their own. German priest P.G. Pessler designed a coffin in 1798 that included a viewing window, food pipe, and air holes. Others added glass lids so observers could detect condensation from breathing. In 1897, a man named Count Michel de Carnicki patented a coffin with a spring-loaded lid that could be opened from the inside. Another design included a system that would raise a flag and simultaneously sound an alarm if movement was detected. Some even incorporated primitive electrical systems that would trip a wire if the body stirred. While some designs were manufactured and sold to the public, few were ever proven to save lives. The cost was often prohibitive, and many churches and cemeteries saw them as unnecessary or blasphemous. But for families gripped by fear, the reassurance was worth the price. Buying a safety coffin was like buying peace of mind, however fragile that might be. Interestingly, the rise in these inventions paralleled broader societal changes. The Industrial Revolution brought about new relationships with machinery, automation, and personal agency. The safety coffin was a machine of last resort, a Victorian panic button. It showed that people trusted gears and levers more than doctors or priests to protect them in their most helpless hour. However, it also highlighted the paradox of the era. For all their faith in science and invention, the Victorians were still deeply driven by fear, superstition, and the need to control death. These coffins weren't just tools, they were symbols of resistance against an invisible, unstoppable fate. And perhaps that's why they capture our imagination today. They're more than morbid curiosities. They're echoes of a time when death was all around, and trust in the living to recognize it was not enough. Behind every safety coffin was a chilling tale that made it necessary. These weren't just hypothetical fears, they were born from horrifying true stories. And in 19th century newspapers, such reports were disturbingly frequent. One of the most infamous came from South Carolina in 1896. A young woman named Octavia Hatcher fell gravely ill, slipped into a coma, and was declared dead after days of unresponsiveness. She was quickly buried due to the intense summer heat, but shortly after her funeral, other townspeople began falling ill with similar symptoms, some of whom later recovered. Her husband, tormented by the possibility of a mistake, had her body exhumed. The coffin's interior told a ghastly tale. Octavia's fingernails were bloodied and broken, the lining shredded in desperate claw marks. She had been alive. Then there was the story of Mrs. Godfrey from France. Buried following a cholera outbreak in 1821, grave workers later heard moaning from below. Her coffin was opened and she was found alive, gasping for breath. She lived another 6 years. In another instance in Germany, a man who had been declared dead was placed in a crypt. Days later, a sexton returning to the crypt heard strange noises. The man was found sitting upright, cold and weak, but alive. Even Edgar Allan Poe was just as inspired by such accounts, writing The Premature Burial in 1844, a fictional tale based on real fears. His story describes a man so terrified of being buried alive that he outfitted his coffin with every possible safeguard. Poe wasn't exaggerating, the obsession was real. These weren't isolated cases. In a time without modern medicine, with no EKGs or reliable methods to confirm brain death, mistakes were inevitable. Conditions like catalepsy, epilepsy, or deep comas often fooled even experienced physicians. With cholera and typhoid epidemics sweeping through towns, bodies were sometimes buried within hours to stop the spread of disease, cutting short any chance of revival. The panic reached such heights that some families kept vigil over the deceased for days, fearing they might awaken. In some regions, waiting mortuaries were established, holding areas where the dead were kept under observation. Corpses were laid out with bells tied to their limbs or mirrors near their mouths to detect breath. In Munich, one such mortuary was staffed 24 hours a day with attendants trained to listen for signs of life. These stories gave terrifying legitimacy to the safety coffin craze. They weren't just superstition, they were survival tools. They reflected a deep-seated anxiety that even in death, we might still be aware, still trapped, still helpless, and that maybe, just maybe, someone would be listening. As panic over premature burial swept across Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries, societies didn't just invent safety coffins, they built entire systems to delay death's finality. From Munich to Vienna, these were the Watchers of the Dead, a network of vigil keepers, mortuary attendants, and mechanical safeguards standing between life and eternal entombment. In Munich, Germany, the solution was unusually elaborate. The city constructed a Leichenhaus, a waiting mortuary, where bodies of the recently deceased were kept under observation for days before burial. Here, each corpse was laid out in a chamber, dressed and displayed. A string was tied delicately to a finger, with the other end attached to a bell above the chamber door. Should the dead stir, should a hand twitch or a finger tremble, the bell would ring, summoning a watchman. This system, primitive as it sounds, was staffed 24/7. Attendants were trained to listen for the faintest sound, watch for breath on mirrors, and monitor subtle changes in body color and stiffness. It wasn't just Germany. In Vienna, waiting mortuaries featured marble slabs and open ventilation to slow decomposition. Grieving families would come to say farewell, comforted by the fact that if their loved one awoke, someone would be there. The fear was so entrenched that entire manuals were written about how to detect life in the seemingly dead, pulse testing, pinpricks, and even pouring vinegar in the mouth to check for reaction. Cemeteries themselves began to change. In some graveyards, watchtowers were erected, not to ward off grave robbers, but to listen for cries from below. Guards were posted for days after burial, ears bent toward the earth, dreading what they might hear. In certain cases, tubing systems were installed from coffin to surface, allowing air to flow, and screams to be heard. Some were equipped with speaking tubes and bells, offering the buried a desperate line to the living world. This era saw death shift from a moment of closure to one of cautious uncertainty. Funerals became suspended farewells. Burial was no longer an end, but a question mark. Is it really over? People asked. Are we burying a body or a soul still clinging to breath? These mortuaries and systems were not born of paranoia alone. They were shaped by experience. First-hand accounts of survivors told again and again that the body can deceive the eye. Catalepsy, comas, and undiagnosed seizures could rob a person of movement and breath without truly ending life. And in the 1800s, without modern diagnostics, the line between life and death was anything but clear. By the late 19th century, even funeral homes in America began adopting European techniques, extending vigils, delaying embalming, and implementing bell systems. Though eventually made obsolete by medical advancements, these Watchers of the Dead once formed society's last defense against the unthinkable, the horror of waking beneath the earth. By the mid-19th century, the fear of premature burial was no longer a fringe anxiety. It had become a cultural obsession, and wherever fear takes root, profit is never far behind. Across Europe and America, a wave of entrepreneurs saw opportunity in death. They began designing, manufacturing, and patenting elaborate safety coffins, each claiming to be the ultimate solution to a waking nightmare. Some were serious attempts at innovation, others bordered on the absurd. One coffin design featured a glass viewing window and an oxygen tank, providing air and visibility to anyone entombed prematurely. Another was equipped with a flagpole, triggered by movement below, which would spring upright and wave frantically until help arrived. Yet another included an escape hatch, internal ladder, and electric alarm that could be activated by the flutter of a hand. In the United States, the panic gave rise to a surprising number of patents. Over 30 separate designs for safety coffins were registered with the US Patent Office between 1860 and 1890 alone. Inventors like Franz Vester, who patented his improved burial case in 1868, included breathing pipes, ladders, bells, and even a glass pipe for friends to peer down at the body, just in case. What began as engineering turned into marketing. Coffin makers and funeral parlours advertised their devices in newspapers and pamphlets with sensational language. Never fear premature burial again. Peace of mind, even in death. Some even staged demonstrations, burying actors in live simulations to prove the efficacy of their devices. Crowds would gather to witness the dramatic resurrection, solidifying both the spectacle and the sale. But not all designs were benign. Some inventors played into the paranoia with intentionally terrifying devices. One design included a blade that would pierce the heart post-burial, just to make sure the person inside was truly dead, called, chillingly, a safety measure. Another proposed a coffin that would ring a bell not from the inside, but automatically 72 hours after burial, just in case. This era birthed a strange hybrid, part medical precaution, part performance, part scam. The anxiety was real, but the solutions were often impractical, dangerous, or untested. Yet desperate families paid dearly for these contraptions, convinced that spending a little more might spare their loved one a fate worse than death. In a twisted irony, some companies even bundled their safety coffins with premium burial insurance packages, playing off emotional vulnerability at a time of loss. For those grieving, or those fearing their own end, it was a grim but compelling upsell. As medical science slowly improved, particularly with the advent of reliable stethoscopes and better understanding of catalepsy and coma, the safety coffin industry began to wane. But for nearly half a century, this bizarre market thrived on a single terrifying premise: that death itself couldn't be trusted. And for the inventors who capitalized on it, it was a gold rush of the macabre, a moment when the line between fear and fortune blurred 6 feet beneath the surface. The hysteria that had gripped the Victorian world of waking up in a coffin buried in darkness, pounding in vain, began to unravel not with a cultural shift, but with a scientific one. As medicine advanced, so too did our ability to define and confirm death. What had once been a terrifyingly ambiguous threshold began to harden into clinical certainty. The stethoscope, first developed in the early 19th century, became a critical tool. It allowed doctors to listen not just for a heartbeat, but for subtle signs of life: shallow breaths, faint pulses, low-resonance echoes of internal motion. With time, death could be diagnosed with more confidence than ever before. In parallel, autopsies were becoming standardized in hospitals and universities across Europe. Post-mortem examinations provided clearer understanding of death's physiological markers: rigor mortis, livor mortis, tissue decay, and taught a new generation of physicians how to distinguish between states like coma, catalepsy, and true biological death. It was an education in finality, and it reshaped the entire death industry. But it wasn't just doctors who changed the narrative, it was forensic science. As toxicology emerged in the late 1800s, coroners could now determine if someone had died by poison, overdose, or natural causes, offering closure in cases that once would have haunted families for decades. The microscope became a tool not only of life, but of death. Governments too stepped in, Legal reforms in countries like Germany, France and England began to mandate waiting periods before burial. In Prussia, the law eventually required a 48-hour observation period, during which a body would be kept in a mortuary under the supervision of a death inspector, a trained physician whose job was to certify the absence of life. This small but critical buffer, time, offered both practical safety and emotional comfort. In most cases, anyone in a trance-like state would either recover or pass away naturally during the waiting period. It was a policy rooted in science and sensitivity, and it drastically reduced the number of suspected premature burials. By the early 20th century, the notion of safety coffins began to seem outdated. Medical journals published critiques of the devices, citing their impracticality and the psychological toll they took on grieving families. More importantly, the public began to trust doctors more than inventors. Still, echoes of the fear remained. Literature and film seized upon the imagery, a hand scraping against a coffin lid, a muffled voice calling from underground. Edgar Allan Poe's The Premature Burial, once read as a cautionary tale, was reinterpreted as psychological horror. The fear shifted from reality to metaphor, from the grave to the subconscious. What we see in hindsight is that the panic over premature burial was never just about biology. It was about control. It was about the need to master death in an age of rapid change, where even the final chapter of life felt uncertain. But as science replaced superstition and reason eclipsed fear, society began to breathe a little easier. No more bells, no more tubes, just knowledge and time. As the world stepped into the 20th century, with electric lights flickering over city streets and automobiles replacing carriages, the safety coffin quietly faded into the background. No longer a commercial success or a medical necessity, it became a curiosity, something preserved not in graveyards but in glass cases. Today, only a handful of original Victorian safety coffins survive. You'll find them not in use but in museums, stored in dim-lit galleries and anatomical archives, displayed beside handwritten patents and grim rusted prototypes. They've become artifacts of an age that tried to conquer death with gears, levers and pulleys. In places like the Museum of Funeral History in Texas or the Morbid Anatomy Library in Brooklyn, visitors can stare into the strange ingenuity of these designs, a coffin with a glass viewing window to monitor decomposition, or a burial lid fitted with a periscope and breathing pipe. Some even include a small vial of food or water, just in case. It's easy to laugh now to see them as macabre overreactions, but when you stand before one, something happens. You begin to feel the weight of desperation, the very human terror of being misunderstood in death, of being erased too soon. The safety coffin, strange as it was, speaks to a deep psychological need to be heard, even from 6 feet under. Historians have come to view these contraptions as more than quirky inventions. They are reflections of an era obsessed with technological control over nature. The Industrial Revolution gave people the illusion that every mystery, from disease to death, could be mechanized, solved, and perhaps even reversed. The safety coffin was part of that illusion. But there's another side to this legacy. The safety coffin reveals not just our fear of death, but our overwhelming desire to be remembered. Think of it, all that effort, money, and engineering, not to prolong life, but to prevent the ultimate indignity, dying without anyone knowing you were still alive. These devices weren't about survival alone. They were monuments to the cry for recognition. In literature, the legacy endures too. Victorian ghost stories, Gothic novels, and modern horror films owe much to this panic. Writers like Poe, Dickens, and even Lovecraft embedded the image of the prematurely buried soul into the collective consciousness. To this day, movies and shows resurrect that same primal fear, adding it to our modern nightmares. And yet, while the devices themselves have disappeared from use, their emotional footprint remains. Some contemporary mortuaries still honour a symbolic waiting period. Others offer living wakes or video wills, 21st century safety mechanisms, but digital rather than mechanical. Ultimately, the story of the safety coffin is not just about Victorian inventiveness. It's about the boundary between life and death, and the uncomfortable realization that, for much of history, that line was far more blurred than we'd like to admit. As we look at these objects in their final resting place, behind glass, beneath museum lights, they seem less like failures and more like mirrors. Mirrors that reflect the terror, hope, and brilliance of a species that simply cannot accept silence in the dark. So now, as the final bell tolls on this strange and haunting journey through Victorian death culture, we're left with more than just the mechanical blueprints of a forgotten invention. We're left with a message, etched not in stone, but in fear, ingenuity, and desperate hope. The safety coffin was not just a device, it was a confession, a whispered fear from a time obsessed with control, yet paralysed by uncertainty. It told us that even in death, the Victorians were not ready to let go. They feared being silenced too soon, misdiagnosed, misunderstood, buried alive, literally and metaphorically. We like to think we've progressed, that we no longer need bells in our graves or periscopes in our coffins, but look closely at our culture, our preservation techniques, our cryogenic fantasies, our digital afterlives. We haven't moved on from the fear. We've only given it new technologies, new myths, new disguises. In the end, the story of the safety coffin is about how deeply human it is to want to be heard, even from the silence of the grave. It is about the voices we fear might never be listened to, the goodbyes we might never get to say, the legacies we fight to leave behind. Each safety coffin, no matter how bizarre, impractical, or ineffective, was an act of resistance. Resistance against finality, against disappearance, against the terror of death being the end not just of life, but of acknowledgement, and ironically, they succeeded. Because here we are, more than a century later, still talking about them. These contraptions may not have saved lives, but they've preserved stories. The clank of their bells still echoes through museums, history books, and our imagination. They've ensured that those who feared being forgotten haven't been. Perhaps that is their greatest achievement. So the next time you hear the phrase safety coffin, don't just picture gears and bells. Picture the mind that built it, the trembling hands, the sleepless nights, the heart racing at the idea of darkness without escape. Picture the fear behind the metal. Picture the voice that hoped, just maybe, it could still be heard. Because in the end, we are all hoping for the same thing. Not immortality, but remembrance. And maybe that's the true function of these peculiar machines. Not to save lives, but to keep the stories buried with them from being buried at all. Thank you for watching. Stay curious, stay listening, and remember, sometimes the past still rings its bell. We began with a terrifying legend of a girl buried too soon, of fingernail scratches on a coffin lid, and of bells ringing in the silence of the grave. But we've seen now that these weren't just ghost stories told to frighten children. They were reflections of a very real fear. In Victorian times, the line between life and death was far blurrier than we'd like to believe. Safety coffins, some brilliant, some bizarre, stood as desperate monuments to human anxiety. They reveal a world where medicine could fail, superstition could flourish, and hope could be wired into a coffin with a bell and a string. The panic wasn't paranoia, it was preparation. Because if even one soul was saved from premature burial, perhaps the fear was justified after all. But what does it say about us? That we built contraptions not to escape death, but to escape being misunderstood by the living. Today, we dismiss these stories as morbid curiosities of a superstitious age. But the truth is, the fear of being forgotten, unheard, or buried before our time still lingers. It's not just about being trapped in a box. It's about the hope that someone, anyone, might still be listening. Even now, beneath the polished marble and modern funerals, lies the same fragile trust in those who outlive us. Trust that they'll know when it's truly our time, that they won't bury our voice, our story, our signal. So, as we close the lid on this tale, perhaps take a moment to listen to the stories beneath the ground, to the bells that may still echo long after they've stopped ringing, because history doesn't always stay buried, and neither do our fears. If this story gave you chills, or made you rethink what the past still whispers, don't let it stay buried. Hit like if the tale struck a nerve. Subscribe for more histories, forgotten fears, lost inventions, and unsolved mysteries. And ring the bell, just in case you ever need to be heard. Got a theory about the girl in the grave, or your own eerie tale from history? Drop it in the comments, we read every one, because in this channel, no strange story stays buried for long.